Hi guys, so Brexit supporter Iain Dale from LBC hosted a show on his channel about, drumroll, Brexit benefits, I kid you not. Now he had a number of guests on to help him out, but he struggled to get above 0. Here is Olivia Otley, an assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, a pro-Brexit newspaper. So surely she could come up with something. Surely. Have a listen.
Well, I agree with Lord Moylan that it can't just be measured in monetary benefit, and it is about the principle of the thing, and that's what we talked about repeatedly over quite a lot of years.
No, it wasn't just about the principle. It wasn't the principle of the thing. It was the economic benefits of leaving the European Union. Jacob Rees-Mogg talked about how food and clothes would be much cheaper. That was a benefit of leaving the European Union. Boris Johnson talked about cutting VAT on fuel to help people during winter to deal with rising energy prices. That was a benefit of leaving the European Union, allegedly. We had Brexiteers banging on about trade deals. Back to Boris Johnson again, £350 million on the side of a bloody bus. No, you don't get to rewrite history and say, no, it wasn't about economic benefits, it was about principles.
And also, I think the point that would be sort of making kind of counterfactual argument if we try to kind of assess it, it's completely true. The EU has changed a lot since we left it.
Has changed a lot. You're using a quantifier here. So how much has the EU changed? A lot. Okay, can we hear some examples of how the EU has changed a lot since the UK has left, the Great Britain has left? Unfortunately, she's not going to give us some examples.
We've seen the EU make a lot of mistakes. I think it's quite easy.
A lot of mistakes. If you said they made one big mistake, we could argue about that, about the vaccine rollout. But a lot of mistakes. What mistakes?
In Britain to sort of watch our government, make a lot of mistakes and say, oh, Britain's so embarrassing. But look at what France has done. Look at what Germany's done.
Now, I have actually reached out to Olivia. I sent her a message on Twitter and I said, if you'd like to have a chat about Brexit, I'd be willing to have a chat. Would you be willing to have a chat with me about Brexit? And she said, thanks, but no thanks. Because if she did have a chat with me, I would explain the difference to her between France and the European Union, Germany and the European Union. Because many Brexiteers don't understand the difference between France and the EU. And I'd like to try and explain that to them, because then they would realize, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't understand there was a difference between France and the EU. Now that you have explained it to me, I will stop making that mistake. And I will tell other Brexiteers who make that mistake that they are making a mistake, and we should stop making that mistake.
Look at how pathetic Germany's being on the Ukraine situation. Look at the way
Germany is not the EU. Why is this so difficult for people to understand? When the UK was a member of the EU, was the UK the EU?
Macron talked down the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is...
Macron is not the EU. I'm not the biggest fan of Macron, but he's not the EU.
Still having effects. We've got an article coming out in the Telegraph tomorrow about the effects it's having on vaccine hesitancy in Africa.
So the EU, if people are not taking the vaccine in Africa, that's the EU's fault via Macron. So because Macron is the EU and he said something about AstraZeneca, that means that what's happening in Africa is the EU's fault. Am I understanding this? I'm confused.
That once he said that, what he said about AstraZeneca, he couldn't take it back, and it caused vaccine hesitancy everywhere.
We're supposed to be talking about the EU here, not about Macron, not about Germany and Ukraine. We're supposed to be talking about the EU. She hasn't got to the EU yet.
So the EU hasn't covered itself in glory over the last couple of years at all, and the EU's moved in a different direction.
Does anyone actually understand what she's saying here? The EU has moved in different directions, hasn't covered itself in glory. We've yet to hear an example of how the EU has done something wrong. And we've yet to hear an example of a benefit of Brexit. This was supposed to be talking about Brexit benefits. I've yet to hear one.
Britain's relationship with the EU was already strained. So what are we comparing Brexit, Brexit Britain too. Britain in a perfect EU.
Sorry, so okay, now I'm really confused. Is she trying to say that if the UK had remained in the European Union and there would have been some perfect EU, you can't compare that to Brexit? But we know that Brexit isn't perfect. And I'm going out on a limb here. There are problems at Dover, for example. Many businesses are struggling to export. If Brexit didn't happen, they wouldn't have these problems. And that's just one example. I don't understand what type of argument she's trying to make here.
Britain in a perfect EU with a perfect relationship with the EU? No. Where would we be if we hadn't left the EU? I think it's...
There wouldn't be problems at the port, for example. Fishermen would be still able to sell their fish. Maybe I see that as a benefit, of remaining in the European Union. You see that as a problem. Is it because you don't like fishermen or you don't like exporters? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me.
It's very difficult to quantify that. And unless we can do that, I don't think a sort of big Brexit assessment would work. But I would say we've already seen a few benefits. I mean,
finally, okay, 1 minute 25 in. We're getting to the Brexit benefit. Okay, finally.
I mean, I think that okay, we could have had our own vaccine program while in the EU, but let's not.
I'm going to cry. So I've been waiting 1 minute 30 seconds of her blabbing on about how Macron is the EU and Germany is the EU and the EU hasn't covered itself in glory. And now we finally got to the Brexit benefit, and she says, well, we still could have done the vaccine rollout as a member of the EU. Your very first example of a benefit of Brexit, and you go to something that's not a benefit of Brexit. Like, you didn't even try.
I'll pretend it would have been easy. Our vaccine program was fantastic. We're getting out of COVID restrictions.
But getting out of COVID restrictions is not a Brexit benefit. Other countries, like New Zealand, hasn't had the impact on its people like many countries around the world. Like South Korea, Japan. They're not members of the EU. They're like, how is getting out of I really don't understand. Has any of this got to do with the EU? Does she not understand that different countries have different rules regarding the pandemic? Italy has a different take. The government in Italy has a different take to dealing with the pandemic than France does. France has a different take to the United States. These are different countries with different approaches to dealing with the pandemic. How is this a Brexit? So what we've heard so far from her in regards to Brexit benefits is something that isn't a Brexit benefit, because she explains herself, yeah, we could have done it while we're in the EU. And the next one is we left the lockdowns and restrictions faster than anyone else. What?
Quicker than almost any other European country. I think some of that does have something to do with...
I think some of that has to do. That's the best you've got. You couldn't say, this is a clear example of how we are benefiting from Brexit. I think perhaps. Okay.
Getting our sovereignty back and being in charge of our own decision.
Getting our sovereignty back. Is the 150,000 people who have died because of the pandemic, is that included in that sovereignty? Isn't it interesting how these Brexiteers never mention that number? It's as if it didn't happen. They completely ignore it. Why do they do that? These are the Brexit benefits. So, crashing the economy, ending freedom of movement, an extremely racist campaign, putting Boris Johnson into number 10, all of this is because of Brexit, and these are all the benefits. I really don't know what else to say, guys. Let me know in the comments. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.